Hello everybody, this is another edition of Reef Automation Tutorials. I've had a number of questions regarding programming possibly a calcium reactor to operate along with the Trident, and also the ability in which to change the potency of the calcium reactor during certain periods of the day. So that's what we're going to go over. So in this case, we're going to make three virtual outlets because I do not have a calcium reactor that works off of a pH like most people do. I have an automatic calcium reactor made by Aquarium Engineering. So for this case, we're going to make three virtual outlets. So we're going to go back to our programming, and you will see I've already made two virtual outlets here at the bottom, and they are calcium reactor day and calcium reactor night. I'm going to make another virtual outlet, and we're going to call it the calcium reactor regulator, which will regulate the pH going into the regulator. We're not going to adjust the flow of the calcium reactor, we're just going to adjust the regulator. All right, so we'll go back to our programming and we'll show you how this is done. So we have our calcium reactor regulator and our calcium reactor night and day. So the first things you want to do is you want to go to your calcium reactor day. And what I would do is set it to, let's say you want to set it to 6.8. So if the calcium reactor pH is greater than 6.8, I'm sorry, if it is, greater than 6.8, then on. So what this means is that the outlet in which the calcium reactor is during the daytime, I want the potency to be 6.8. Okay, so if it's greater than 6.8, I want to turn on, and then we're going to put a set off here, which means that it will not function unless the calcium reactor is above 6.8. Once it gets to 6.8, it'll turn off. And you could do this a number of different ways. You can have a range. You can have, if the reef pH is less than 6.9, then off. And then that would mean if it's between 6.8 and 6.9, it'll go between the day. That way your solenoid for your regulator isn't going off and on and off and on and off and on. All right, so let me fix this one right here so it's red. So there's our calcium reactor day. Basically, it's going to mimic the 6.8 and 6.9 for the regulator. Now, the one thing that we need to do is assign the daytime to this outlet. So we're going to say time, and let's just say for this we'll do 10 a.m. to, I don't know, let's do 18, then off. So what this means is that this regulator will only come on between the time of 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., and otherwise it will be off. I apologize. Let me adjust this to the correct amount here. So it'll be off during the times during the night, and it will be on based on if its pH is 6.8. So next, we'll go to our nighttime. You'll see right now, look, calcium reactor is on right now because it's during the day. So there's a nice feature up here which allows you to copy any other outlet right here. So now during the night, we want our potency to be a little bit different. We want our potency to be, let's say 7.2, okay? And then we want this to actually go to the opposite of the daytime, which would be nighttime, okay? So now at night, it's going to utilize the 7.2, and during the day, it's going to use a 6.8 to 6.9. And you know what, we'll change this guy to, if it's less than, let's do 7.1, that's fine. So now we have a day and a night schedule for our calcium reactor, which will change the potency based on the time. Now you go to your regulator, And all you do is you say if outlet calcium reactor day equals on, then on. If outlet calcium reactor night is on, then on. Now, you do want to put a set here because you want the regulator to be off otherwise, and you do want to put a fallback so that way the regulator is off. So what this will do is it will basically turn on the regulator or the solenoid and the regulator for your CO2 during the daytime and the nighttime based on those two schedules. Now, to integrate the Trident, you can also put if your Reef alkalinity is, let's say, greater than 9, then off. And that'll kill the regulator completely while the Reef alkalinity is higher than 9. And that way you can kind of stabilize so it doesn't overshoot. And you can put that alkalinity to wherever you want. And that's how I would do it with the Trident on the regulator side. So that's the quick and dirty, easy way to set up a calcium reactor with the Trident and with the ability to adjust the potency of the pH for different periods. Now, again, you can add 5, 6, 7 virtual outlets and call them day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and they would have all different potencies throughout the day. And then all you do in here is you would add the outlet to the virtual, or I'm sorry, to your solenoid or to your regulator, and then it will just turn on during those periods of time. So that is how you program a calcium reactor potency time schedule throughout the day, and also how you adjust to the Trident's alkalinity, so that way you can make it so the solenoid only comes on during certain periods of time, and therefore you don't have to adjust the flow, you don't have to adjust the pH. You can just basically kill the solenoid during periods of times that you don't want the potency to be as high. You can also put this Reef alkalinity line in your calcium reactor feed pump. So you can turn off the feed pump if the alkalinity gets too high. That's another way of doing it. I think it's better to do it from the potency side, so that way you don't have to worry about adjusting the feed pump. You don't have to adjust when that comes on and off. You don't have to be worried if it gets clogged up, for instance. That way the flow is continuously going. So anyway, please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comments below. Again, this is a very basic way of doing this. If you have any further questions, we have live streams every Saturday morning, and I can go over this with you guys at any point in time. Other than that, have a great day, and thank you for watching.